Chapter B. Father and Mother. It is argued that the overtness of the masochist's conflict with the mother, his readiness to incriminate her, should convince us that it is not the mother but the father who plays the central role. But this is to assume that all resistances spring from repression, and in any case the masochist's alleged resistance might just as easily take the form of a displacement from one mother figure to another. It is not enough either to point to the muscular build and the furs of the torturess as evidence of a composite image. The father hypothesis stands in need of serious phenomenological or symptomatological support and cannot be made to rest on a line of reasoning which already presupposes an etiology, and with it the fallacious concept of a sadomasochistic entity. It is assumed that since the father image is a determinant in sadism, this must also be true for masochism, the same factors operating in both cases, once one allows for the inversions, projections, and blurring characteristic of masochism. From this viewpoint the masochist would start by wishing to take the place of the father and steal his potency. The sadistic stage, a feeling of guilt would then arise, and with it the fear of castration, leading him to renounce the active aim and take the place of the mother in soliciting the father's love. But in order to avoid the new onset of guilt and castration fear to which the passive role gives rise, he would now replace the desire to be loved by the father with the desire to be beaten, which not only represents a lesser form of punishment, but is a substitute for the love relationship itself. But why is it the mother who does the beating and not, as we should expect, the father? We are given various reasons for this. First, the need to avoid a choice which is too blatantly homosexual. Second, the need to preserve the first stage where the mother was the desired object, and graft onto it the punishing action of the father. Finally, the need to present the whole process as a kind of demonstration or plea addressed solely to the father. You see, it is not I who wanted to take your place, it is she who hurts, castrates and beats me. If the father appears to play the decisive role throughout these successive stages, it is because masochism is treated as a combination of highly abstract elements subject to various transformations. There is a failure to appreciate the total concrete situation, the specific world of the perversion. We are not given a genuinely differential diagnosis because the symptoms themselves have been obscured by a preconceived etiology. Even such notions as castration and guilt lose their explanatory force when they are used to show that situations that are fundamentally unrelated nevertheless reverse into one another and are thus related after all. Modes of equivalence and translation are mistaken for systems of transition and transformation. Even a psychoanalyst of Rake's insight can say, whenever we had the opportunity to study a case we found the father or his representative hidden behind the figure of the beating woman. In making such a statement we need to be far more specific about the meaning of hidden, and to explain under what conditions someone or something can be said to be hidden in the relation between symptoms and causes. The same author adds, after having considered, tested, and put all this in the balance, there yet remains a doubt: does not the oldest stratum of masochism as fantasy and action regress after all to the mother-child relationship as to a historical reality? And yet he upholds what he calls his impression concerning the essential and constant role of the father. Point 14. Is he speaking about symptoms or offering an etiology based on combinations of abstractions? We are again faced with the question whether the belief in the determinate role of the father in masochism is not simply the result of the preconceived notion of a sadomasochistic entity. The paternal and patriarchal theme undoubtedly predominates in sadism. There are many heroines in Sada's novels, but their actions, the pleasures they enjoy together and their common projects are all in imitation of man. Man is the spectator and presiding genius to whom all their activities are dedicated. Sada's androgynous creations are the product of an incestuous union of father and daughter. Although parricide occurs as frequently as matricide in the work of Sada, the two forms of crime are far from equivalent. Sada equates the mother with secondary nature, which is composed of soft molecules and is subject to the laws of creation, conservation, and reproduction. The father by contrast only belongs to this nature through social conservatism. Intrinsically he represents primary nature, which is beyond all constituted order and is made up of wild and lacerating molecules that carry disorder and anarchy, paters of natura prima. Therefore the father is murdered only insofar as he departs from his true nature and function, while the mother is murdered because she remains faithful to hers. As Klossowski has shown with the greatest insight, the sadistic fantasy ultimately rests on the theme of the father destroying his own family, by inciting the daughter to torture and murder the mother. Point 15. In sadism the Oedipal image of woman is made, as it were, to explode. The mother becomes the victim par excellence, while the daughter is elevated to the position of incestuous accomplice. For since the institution of the family and even the law are affected by the maternal character of secondary nature, the father can only be a father by overriding the law, by dissolving the family and prostituting its members. The father represents nature as a primitive anarchic force that can only be restored to its original state by destroying the laws and the secondary beings that are subject to them. The ultimate aim of the sadist is to put an effective end to all procreation, since it competes with primary nature. What makes Sada's heroine sadistic is their sodomitic union with the father in a fundamental alliance against the mother. Sadism is in every sense an active negation of the mother and an exaltation of the father who is beyond all laws. In The Passing of the Oedipus Complex, Freud points to two possible outcomes: the active sadistic, where the child identifies with the father, and the passive masochistic, where he takes instead the place of the mother and desires to be loved by the father. The theory of partial impulses allows for the coexistence of these two entities and thus lends support to the belief in the unity of sadism and masochism. Freud says of the wolf man, in his sadism he maintained his ancient identification with his father, but in his masochism he chose him as a sexual object. So when we are told that the character who does the beating in masochism is the father, we are entitled to ask, who in reality is being beaten? Where is the father hidden? Could it not be in the person who is being beaten? The masochist feels guilty, he asks to be beaten, he expiates, but why and for what crime? Is it not precisely the father image in him that is thus miniaturized, beaten, ridiculed and humiliated? What the subject atones for is his resemblance to the father and the father's likeness in him. The formula of masochism is the humiliated father. Hence the father is not so much the beater as the beaten. A point of great significance in the fantasy of the three mothers is the symbolic transfer or redistribution of all paternal functions to the threefold feminine figure. The father is excluded and completely nullified. Most of Masocha's novels contain a hunting scene which is described in minute detail. The ideal woman hunts a bear or a wolf and despoils it of its fur. We could interpret this symbolically as the struggle of woman against man, from which woman emerges triumphant. But this would be a mistake, since woman has already triumphed when masochism begins. The bear and the fur have already been invested with an exclusively feminine significance. The animal stands for the primitive etheric mother, the pre-birth mother. It is hunted and despoiled for the benefit of the oral mother, with the aim of achieving a rebirth, a parthenogenetic second birth in which, as we shall see, the father has no part. It is true that man reappears at the opposite pole, on the side of the Oedipal mother. An alliance is contracted between the third woman and the sadistic man, Elizabeth and Ipolgar in the Fountain of Youth, Dragomira and Bogislav in the Fissure of Souls, and Wanda and the Greek in Venus. But this reappearance of man is compatible with masochism only to the extent that the Oedipal mother maintains her rights and her integrity. Not only does the man appear in effeminate, transvestite form, the Greek in Venus, but in contrast to what happens in sadism, the mother representative is the accomplice and the young girl is the victim. In The Fountain of Youth, the masochistic hero allows Elizabeth to murder Giselle, the young girl he loves. Where the sadistic man happens to triumph, as he does at the end of Venus, all masochistic activity ceases. Like the forms in Plato, it withdraws or perishes rather than unite with its opposite, sadism. However, the transfer of the functions of the father onto the three mother images is only one aspect of the fantasy. The main significance of the fantasy lies in the concentration of all the maternal functions in the person of the second mother, the oral or good mother. It is a mistake to relate masochism to the theme of the bad mother. There are of course bad mothers in masochism, the two extremes of the uterine mother and the Oedipal mother, but this is because the whole tendency of masochism is to idealize the functions of the bad mother and transfer them onto the good mother. The function of prostitution belongs specifically to the uterine, heteric mother, and is transformed by the sadistic hero into an institution designed to destroy the Oedipal mother and make the daughter into an accomplice. Although we find in masoch and masochism a similar propensity to prostitute the woman, we should not regard this as proof that sadism and masochism share in a common nature. The important difference in this case is that in masochism the woman assumes the function of prostitution in her capacity as honest woman, the mother in her capacity as the good oral mother. Wanda relates how masoch persuaded her to look for lovers, to answer advertisements and to prostitute herself. But he justified this desire as follows: how delightful to find in one's own respectable, honest and good wife a voluptuousness that must usually be sought among women of easy virtue. The mother, insofar as she is oral, respectable, and pure, must assume the function of prostitute normally reserved for the uterine mother. The same is true of the sadistic functions of the Oedipal mother. The administration of cruelty is taken over by the good mother and is thus profoundly transformed and put to the service of the masochistic ideal of expiation and rebirth. Prostitution should not therefore be regarded as a common feature that links up the two perversions. The dream of universal prostitution, as it appears in Sada's Society of the Friends of Crime, is embodied in an objective institution that aims to destroy the mother and give preferment to the daughter. The mother becomes an outcast and the daughter a partner. In masoch, on the contrary, the ideal form of prostitution is based on a private contract whereby the masochist persuades his wife, in her capacity as good mother, to give herself to other men. 16 Thus the oral mother as the ideal of masochism is expected to assume all the functions of the other female figures. In taking on these functions, she transforms and sublimates them. This is why we feel that psychoanalytic interpretations relating masochism to the bad mother are of very limited applicability. This concentration of functions in the person of the good oral mother is one of the ways in which the father is cancelled out, and his parts and functions distributed among the three women. The way is thus made clear for the struggle and the epiphany of the three women, which will eventually result in the triumph of the oral woman. In short, the three women constitute a symbolic order in which and through which the father is abolished in advance, for all time. This eternal, timeless supremacy of the mother can only be expressed in the language of myths, which is therefore essential to masochism. Everything has already happened, and the entire action takes place between the mother images, thus the hunt and the conquest of the fur. It is therefore surprising that even the most enlightened psychoanalytic writers link the emergence of a symbolic order with the name of the father. This is surely to cling to the singularly unanalytical conception of the mother as the representative of nature and the father as sole principle and representative of culture and law. The masochist experiences the symbolic order as an intermaternal order in which the mother represents the law under certain prescribed conditions. She generates the symbolism through which the masochist expresses himself. It is not a case of identification with the mother, as is mistakenly believed. The threefold division of the mother literally expels the father from the masochistic universe. In The Siren, Masoch tells the story of a young boy who allows people to believe that his father is dead merely because he finds it easier and more polite not to dispel a misunderstanding. There is a disavowal of the mother by magnifying her. Symbolically, the mother lacks nothing, and a corresponding disavowal of the father by degrading him. The father is nothing. In other words, he is deprived of all symbolic function. We need therefore to examine more closely the way in which man, the third element, is introduced or reintroduced in the masochistic fantasy. The life and work of Masoch were dominated by the quest for this third party whom he calls the Greek. However, in Venus the character has two aspects. The first more fantasy aspect is effeminate. The Greek is like a woman. In Paris he has been seen dressed up as a woman, and men were showering him with love letters. The second aspect is virile and marks on the contrary the end of the fantasy and of the masochistic exercise. When the Greek takes up the whip and thrashes Severin, the supersensual charm quickly dissolves. Voluptuous dream, woman, and love, all melt away. The novel has a sublime and humorous ending, with Severin giving up masochism and turning sadist. We may therefore conclude that the father, though abolished in the symbolic order, nevertheless continues to act in the order of the real 17 or of experience. There is a fundamental law, first formulated by Jacques Lacan, according to which an object which has been abolished on the symbolic plane resurges in the real in a hallucinatory form. 18 The final episode of Venus is a typical instance of the aggressive and hallucinatory return of the father in a world that has symbolically abolished him. Everything in the text suggests that the full reality of the scene can only be experienced in a hallucinatory manner. The hallucination, in return, makes the pursuit or continuance of the fantasy impossible. It would therefore be thoroughly misleading to confuse the fantasy that comes into play in the symbolic order and the hallucination that represents the return of what had been symbolically abolished. Theodore Rake quotes a case where all the magic vanishes from the masochistic scene because the subject thinks he recognizes in the woman about to strike him a trait that reminds him of the father. 19 The same thing happens at the end of Venus, and even more strikingly, since here, as a result of the actual substitution of a father figure, the Greek, for the torturess, Severin is moved to give up the masochistic aim altogether. Rake seems to regard the case quoted above as proof that the torturess essentially represents the father and that the mother image is the father in disguise, an argument once again in favor of a sadomasochistic entity. In our opinion, the conclusion should be quite the reverse. Rake maintains that the subject is disillusioned, but we ought rather to say that he is disfantasized, fantasy giving way to hallucination and a hallucinatory state. Far from being the truth behind masochism and the confirmation of its connection with sadism, the aggressive return of the father disrupts the masochistic situation. It represents the constant threat from the side of reality to the masochist's world and to the defenses that condition and limit the symbolic world of his perversion. It would be wild psychoanalysis to favor this breakdown of his defenses by mistaking the protest from external reality for the expression of an inner reality. What are the masochistic defenses against both the reality and the hallucination of the father's aggressive return? The masochistic hero must evolve a complex strategy to protect his world of fantasy and symbols, and to ward off the hallucinatory inroads of reality, or to put it differently, the real attacks of hallucination. This procedure which, as we shall see, is constantly used in masochism, is the contract. A contract is established between the hero and the woman, whereby at a precise point in time and for a determinate period she is given every right over him. By this means the masochist tries to exorcise the danger of the father and to ensure that the temporal order of reality and experience will be in conformity with the symbolic order, in which the father has been abolished for all time. Through the contract, that is through the most rational and temporarily determinate act, the masochist reaches toward the most mythical and the most timeless realms, where the three mother images dwell. Finally, he ensures that he will be beaten. We have seen that what is beaten, humiliated, and ridiculed in him is the image and the likeness of the father, and the possibility of the father's aggressive return. It is not a child but a father that is being beaten. The masochist thus liberates himself in preparation for a rebirth in which the father will have no part. But how shall we account for the fact that even in the contract the masochist requires a third party, the Greek? Why should he so ardently desire this third party? The answer is that the Greek, while he undoubtedly evokes the danger of the aggressive return of the father, also stands for something more, something of an entirely different kind, namely the hope of a rebirth, the projection of the new man that will result from the masochistic experiment. The Greek is a compound figure combining various elements. When he is idealized, he foreshadows the outcome of masochism and stands for the new man. In his sadistic role, by contrast, he represents the dangerous father who brutally interrupts the experiment and interferes with the outcome. Let us remind ourselves of the fundamental structure of fantasy in general, for the art of masochism is the art of fantasy. Fantasy plays on two series, two opposite margins, and the resonance thus set up gives life to and creates the heart of the fantasy. In masochism the two symbolic margins are the uterine mother and the edible mother. Between them and moving from one to the other is the oral mother, the core of the fantasy. The masochist plays on the two extremes and causes them to produce a resonance in the oral mother. He thereby invests her with an amplitude which repeatedly brings her very close to the figures of her rivals. The oral mother must wrest from the uterine mother her eteric functions, prostitution, and from the edible mother her sadistic functions, punishment. At either end of her pendulum-like motion, the good mother must confront the third party, the anonymous uterine mother and the sadistic edible mother. But in point of fact, unless things take a turn for the worse as a result of the hallucinatory return of the father, the third party is never invited or sought after for its own sake, but to be neutralized by the substitution of the good mother for the uterine and the edible mother. The Adventure with Ludwig II admirably illustrates this. Its comic effect is due to the parries put up by the two characters in confrontation. Point 20 When Mazok receives the first letters from Anatole, he sincerely hopes that his correspondent is a woman. But he has already planned his parry in case it should be a man. He will introduce Wanda into the affair and in collusion with the third party will get her to perform a eteric or sadistic function, but in her capacity as good mother. Whereupon Anatole, who has other plans, replies with an unexpected parry, and introduces his hunchback cousin who is intended to neutralize Wanda herself, contrary to all Mazok's intentions. The question whether masochism is feminine and passive and sadism virile and active is only of secondary importance. In any case it arises from the presupposition that sadism and masochism are complementary, the one being the reverse of the other. But sadism and masochism do not together constitute a single entity. They are not respectively made up of partial impulses, but each is complete in itself. The masochist's experience is grounded in an alliance between the son and the oral mother, the sadists in the alliance of father and daughter. In both cases this alliance is confirmed by the respective disguises. In masochism the masculine impulse is embodied in the role of the son, while the feminine impulse is projected in the role of the mother, but in point of fact the two impulses constitute one single figure. Femininity is posited as lacking in nothing and placed alongside of virility suspended in disavowal, just as the absence of a penis need not indicate lack of the phallus, its presence likewise need not indicate possession of the phallus. Hence in masochism a girl has no difficulty in assuming the role of son in relation to the beating mother who possesses the ideal phallus and on whom rebirth depends. Similarly, in sadism, it becomes possible for the boy to play the role of a girl in relation to a projection of the father. We might say that the masochist is hermaphrodite and the sadist androgynous. They represent parallel worlds, each complete in itself, and it is both unnecessary and impossible for either to enter the other's world. We cannot at any rate say that they are exact opposites, except insofar as opposites avoid each other and must either do so or perish. This very opposition tends unfortunately to suggest possibilities of transformation, reversal, and combination. Yet there is between sadism and masochism an irreducible dissymmetry. Sadism stands for the active negation of the mother and the inflation of the father, who is placed above the law. Masochism proceeds by a twofold disavowal, a positive, idealizing disavowal of the mother, who is identified with the law, and an invalidating disavowal of the father, who is expelled from the symbolic order.